The applause inside the grand vaulted auditorium of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology was deafening, a roaring sea of sound that should have felt like a triumph. Instead, it felt like an execution. I stood on the velvet-lined stage, the heavy fabric of my graduation gown trapping the heat of 1,000 bright lights, my fingers gripping the edges of the podium so tightly, my knuckles turned translucent white. Across the room, sitting in the third row of the VIP section, were the two people who had spent 22 years convincing me I was nothing more than background noise. My mother, elegant and poised in her tailored pastel suit, was leaning forward, her hands hovering near her mouth in sudden, paralyzing shock. Beside her, my father's face had drained of all its usual arrogant color, his jaw slack as he stared up at the massive digital screen, displaying my name, my face, and the highest honors the institution could bestow. Mom's eyes welling with tears wasn't a sight of pride. It was the terrifying realization of a catastrophic mistake. As she reached out, her manicured hand trembling violently to grab my father's arm, her lips parted. I didn't need a microphone to hear the desperate, ragged whisper that left her mouth. "Fred, what did we do?" But to understand why my mother was weeping on the most prestigious day of my life, you have to understand the quiet, suffocating prison of my childhood. You have to understand how a family can love one child so fiercely that they completely consume the oxygen of the other. Growing up, my twin brother, Julian, was the sun, and I was merely the shadow he cast. It wasn't a subtle favoritism. It was an explicit doctrine written into the very fabric of our household. Julian was the prodigy, the golden boy with the effortless smile and the quick wit that my father swore mirrored his own genius. I, on the other hand, was Maya, the quiet one, the structured one, the one whose achievements were treated not as successes, but as basic obligations. If Julian brought home a B+ in advanced algebra, my father would take him out for steak, praising his creative mind that refused to be boxed in by rigid grading systems. If I brought home a perfect score on a national chemistry Olympiad, my mother would merely glance at the paper, sigh softly, and ask if I had remembered to fold Julian's laundry before the track meet. "He has potential, Maya," my father told me on the night of our 16th birthday, his voice flat, completely devoid of malice but dripping with a casual cruelty that cut deeper than any scream. We were sitting at the kitchen island, the remnants of Julian's massive surprise party, still littering the lawn outside. I had spent the evening cleaning up the red plastic cups, while Julian was upstairs testing out his new dirt bike, a gift our parents had spent months saving for. I had received a leather-bound journal. "Julian has that rare explosive spark," my father continued, swirling the ice in his glass. "You are diligent, yes, you are disciplined, but discipline only gets you to the baseline. It's Julian who will change the world. You need to understand your limits so you don't set yourself up for heartbreak." I remember looking down at my hands, feeling a strange, hollow ache spreading through my chest. I didn't cry. I had already learned that tears in our house were viewed as a performance, an annoying bid for attention that my parents didn't have the emotional currency to spend on me. I just nodded, absorbing the poison into my system, letting it settle into my bones. But the true betrayal, the moment that permanently fractured the foundation of our family, didn't happen in high school. It happened on a crisp Tuesday afternoon in April, when two identical, thick white envelopes arrived in our mailbox, both bearing the prestigious crimson and silver crest of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. We had both been accepted. It was a miracle that should have united our family in a frenzy of celebration. Instead, it became the arena for my ultimate humiliation. That evening, the dining table was set with the fine china. A bottle of expensive champagne sat sweating in a silver bucket next to my father's chair. I sat down, my heart hammering against my ribs, a fragile, dangerous spark of hope igniting in my chest. For the first time, I thought, we are equal. For the first time, they will see me. My father poured 3 glasses of champagne, completely bypassing my water glass. He raised his flute, his eyes shining as he looked at my brother. To Julian, he boomed, his voice thick with emotion, an MIT man. The future of our family legacy. And to Maya, Julian added quickly, perhaps feeling a rare prick of sibling guilt as he glanced at my empty hands. We both got in, Dad. My father set his glass down, the sharp clink against the mahogany table silencing the room. The warmth drained from his eyes as he turned his gaze to me, replacing it with a heavy, clinical seriousness that made my breath hitch. We need to have a practical discussion about that, he said smoothly. My mother reached across the table, not to take my hand, but to gently touch my father's forearm in a gesture of solidarity. Maya, sweetheart, she began, her voice dripping with a patronizing sweetness that felt like sandpaper on an open wound. You know how tight our finances have been with the market downturn. Put simply, we cannot afford 2 MIT tuitions. It's an impossibility. My throat tightened, a sudden wave of nausea washing over me. But the financial aid packages, I whispered, my voice sounding incredibly small in the vast, formal dining room. They aren't enough, my father interrupted, cutting through my defense with practiced ease, and we refuse to drown this family in debt. So, your mother and I had to make an executive decision based on return on investment. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, looking at me not as his daughter, but as a failing corporate asset. We are paying for Julian's tuition in full. Every cent. As for you, Maya, you will need to decline the offer and attend the state college down the road. They have a perfectly adequate program. The room spun. The walls seemed to close in, suffocating me. Return on investment. The words echoed in my mind, stripping away whatever dignity I had left. Dad, that's not fair, Julian muttered, looking down at his plate. Though he didn't push his champagne glass away. He didn't offer to split the difference. He didn't say he would refuse to go unless we both did. Fairness is a luxury for people who don't have to live in the real world, Julian, my father snapped gently before turning back to me. His next words were the final nail in the coffin of my childhood, a phrase that would play on a loop in my mind for the next 4 grueling years. He has potential, Maya. You don't. It's simple mathematics. We have to back the horse that can win the race. I looked at my mother, silently begging for a glimmer of maternal instinct, a single protest. But she merely offered a sad, helpless shrug. It's for the best, Maya. You wouldn't want to go somewhere you'd constantly be struggling to keep up with your brother anyway. This saves you from the embarrassment. I didn't scream. I didn't throw my plate. I sat there, a ghost at my own funeral, watching my family celebrate the future they had stolen from me, to hand to my brother on a silver platter. But as I stared at the crimson crest on the acceptance letter tucked under my napkin, something shifted deep within the dark, neglected corners of my soul. The compliance that had defined my life for 18 years withered away, replaced by a cold, terrifying iron. They thought they had decided my future. They thought they had successfully locked me out of the gates. What they didn't know was that I had already signed the acceptance papers that afternoon at school. I was going to MIT, and I was going to do it completely alone, without a single dollar of their blood money. As my father raised his glass for another toast, I looked at him, my expression entirely unreadable. You think you know my limits, I thought. The silence in my mind turning deafening. But you have no idea what a person is capable of when they have absolutely nothing left to lose. What my parents didn't realize was that my silence wasn't acceptance. It was the birth of a ghost network. I had exactly 3 months before the fall semester began, 3 months to orchestrate a financial and logistical miracle, or face the public execution of my dreams. If they found out I was defying them, they would cut me off entirely, not just from a college fund that didn't exist, but from the roof over my head before I could even pack my bags. How does an 18-year-old girl raise tens of thousands of dollars in 90 days without her parents noticing? I began living a double life. By day, I was the compliant, defeated daughter, quietly filling out applications for the local state college, while my mother enthusiastically bought monogrammed towels and high-end laptops for Julian's upcoming move to Boston. By night, when the house was dead silent and the only sound was the hum of the air conditioner, I sat in the dark glow of my cheap phone screen, hunting for every obscure, overlooked scholarship in the country. I applied for grants for left-handed women in STEM, essays on local historical figures, and corporate bursaries hidden deep in the archives of the internet. I slept 2 hours a night, my eyes bloodshot, my body aching with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. But scholarships wouldn't cover the immediate mandatory enrollment deposits or the housing fees due before the financial aid could ever kick in. I needed cash, and I needed it immediately. One afternoon, while my mother was out at her weekly bridge club, I walked into my father's home office. My heart was hammering so violently against my ribs I was certain it would bruise. I wasn't there to steal money. I was there to take what was legally mine, tucked away in the back of his fireproof safe. A combination I had accidentally memorized years ago, when he grew careless after too many scotches, were the savings bonds my grandmother had left specifically to me when she passed away when I was 10. My parents had conveniently forgotten about them, planning to absorb them into Julian's fund. My hands shook as I spun the dial. Left 24, right 11, left 89. The heavy iron door clicked open with a sound that felt as loud as a gunshot in the empty house. My breath caught. There they were. 3 crisp blue certificates, each worth $5,000 upon maturity. My grandmother's elegant cursive handwriting spelled out my name across the top. For Maya's bright future. As my fingers closed around the paper, a floorboard creaked loudly out in the hallway. My entire body went completely rigid. The front door hadn't opened, but the sound was unmistakable. Someone was inside the house. If my father had come home early and caught me at his safe, my life, my future, and my secret plan would be obliterated before it ever began. I froze, holding my breath, staring at the open safe, terrified to look up at who was standing in the doorway. My heart stopped. The shadow lengthening across the hardwood floor of my father's office belonged to Julian. He was leaning against the doorframe, his varsity jacket slung carelessly over one shoulder, a half-eaten apple in his hand. He stared at me, then down at my hands, which were still gripping the blue savings bonds inside the open safe. The silence between us stretched, thick and suffocating. This was the moment. If Julian called our father, my story would end right here, crushed under the weight of family loyalty and my father's wrath. "What are you doing, Maya?" Julian asked softly, taking a slow bite of the apple. There was no anger in his voice, only a profound, unsettling curiosity. "Taking what's mine," I said, my voice steady. Though every nerve in my body was screaming, I didn't slide the bonds back. I didn't flinch. I stood my ground, looking my twin brother dead in the eye. "Grandma left these to me. Dad kept them to pay for your meal plan." Julian looked at the bonds, then around the luxurious office that had always served as a monument to his potential. For a second, I saw a flicker of genuine shame cross his face, the fleeting guilt of a golden child who realizes his throne is built on his siblings' bones. He chewed slowly, swallowed, and then let out a long, quiet sigh. "I didn't ask for them to cut you out, Maya," he whispered. "But you didn't refuse it either," I replied, the truth cutting through the air like a razor. "You accepted the champagne. You accepted the laptop. You're letting them drown me so you can float." Julian closed his eyes for a brief moment. When he opened them, he looked away, tossing the core of his apple into the trash can. "I didn't see anything," he muttered, turning on his heel and walking back down the hallway. "But if Dad catches you, I can't help you." The heavy iron door of the safe clicked shut, and with it the final tether, tying me to my family's goodwill severed. I cashed the bonds the next morning at a bank across town, opening a private account my parents had no visibility into. It was exactly $15,000. Combined with the obscure micro scholarships I had stayed up until 3 a.m. applying for, I finally had enough to cover my first semester's tuition and a deposit on a depressing subterranean studio apartment 4 blocks away from MIT's campus. The rest of the summer was an exercise in psychological warfare. I had to play the part of the broken, compliant daughter who had accepted her bleak fate at the local state college. I watched as my mother spent weekends packing Julian's designer luggage, buying him Egyptian cotton sheets for his dorm, and curating his perfect Ivy League aesthetic. "Don't worry, Maya," my mother said, one afternoon without looking up from the label maker she was using to mark Julian's coats. "State College is much closer to home. You can come back every weekend and help us around the house. It'll be nice to have you around to keep things organized while Julian is away doing big things." "Of course, Mom," I said smoothly, folding one of Julian's sweaters with practiced precision. "I'll make sure everything is taken care of." The lie tasted like ash in my mouth, but it was a necessary shield. If they knew I was going to Boston, they would have confiscated my car, frozen the meager bank account I used for gas money, and orchestrated a massive family intervention to put me back in my place. They needed to believe they had broken me. Arrogant people are never more vulnerable than when they believe they have completely won. The day of departure arrived like a sudden thunderstorm. Julian and my parents were driving up to Boston together in my father's pristine Mercedes, treating the trip like a royal coronation. I was left behind, supposedly to pack my things for the State College move-in day, which was scheduled for the following week. I stood on the front porch, watching them load the final bags into the trunk. My mother walked up to me, giving me a brief, distracted pat on the shoulder. "Make sure you lock the back door when you leave for your classes next week, Maya, and don't forget to water the ferns." My father didn't even get out of the driver's seat. He merely rolled down the window, adjusting his sunglasses. "Work hard at State, Maya. Remember, there's no shame in a modest life. Not everyone is built for the stratosphere." "Goodbye, Dad," I said, a faint, chilling smile touching my lips. "Have a safe drive." I watched the red taillights of the Mercedes disappear down our tree-lined street. The moment they turned the corner, the quiet compliance washed off me. I sprinted up the stairs, grabbed the single duffel bag and 2 cardboard boxes I had hidden in the back of my closet, and threw them into the trunk of my beat-up, 10-year-old sedan. I didn't leave a note. I didn't leave a tearful explanation. I simply turned the key in the ignition and pointed my car toward Boston. When I arrived at MIT's campus later that evening, the reality of what I had done hit me like a physical blow. While Julian was moving into a beautiful, sunlit dorm room funded entirely by our parents' pride, I was carrying my leaking cardboard boxes down a flight of concrete stairs into a basement apartment that smelled of damp earth and old copper pipes. The single window looked out onto a sidewalk grid, offering a view of nothing but the dirty shoes of passing strangers. I sat down on my mattress, which lay directly on the linoleum floor, and pulled out my phone. There were 3 missed calls from my mother, followed by a text message that read, "Maya, your father noticed his safe was reorganized. Do you know anything about this? Also, why aren't you answering the landline?" I stared at the screen, my fingers hovering over the glass. If I told them the truth now, the storm would break before I had a roof over my head. I needed time. I needed to establish myself within the university system where they couldn't touch me. I typed out a quick, detached response. "I'm staying at a friend's house near the state campus early to get used to the commute. The safe was fine when I saw it. I'll check in later." I turned my phone off, threw it onto the mattress, and buried my face in my hands. The room was freezing, the radiator letting out a low, mocking hiss. I was 18 years old, entirely broke, completely alone in a strange city, and carrying a lie that could implode my entire life at any moment. The next morning was the official freshman convocation. I dressed in my only sharp blazer, walking onto the massive lawn where thousands of students and their wealthy families were mingling, sipping iced coffees, and taking celebratory photos. And then, across the crowded plaza, I spotted them. My mother was laughing, adjusting Julian's collar, while my father stood beside a prominent faculty member, nodding aggressively and handing him a business card. They were a picture-perfect family of success. I instinctively stepped behind a stone pillar, my breath catching in my throat. I was only 50 feet away from them. If my father turned his head just a few degrees to the left, he would see his unremarkable daughter standing in the middle of the courtyard of the world's elite institute of technology. My heart hammered against my ribs as I saw my father gesture toward the main administration building. They were walking directly toward my pillar. I pressed my back against the cold granite of the pillar, pulling my breath deep into my lungs, trying to make myself as small as humanly possible. The laughter of my family drifted past me, sharp and distinct. I could hear the exact tone of my father's voice, that booming, self-assured timbre he used when he wanted everyone within a 20-foot radius to know he belonged exactly where he was standing. We've always known Julian was destined for Cambridge. My father was telling the faculty member, his words dripping with unearned arrogance. He's got that raw, disruptive intellect. Some kids you have to push, you know? But with Julian, we just had to clear the track and watch him run. It's an honor to have him in the department, Mr. Vance, the professor replied smoothly. We expect great things from this incoming class. I closed my eyes, my eyelids trembling. Clear the track. Yes, they had cleared it, all right. They had stripped away my lane, dismantled my hurdles, and used the timber to build Julian's starting block. I waited, counting the agonizing seconds by the thumping of my own pulse, until the footsteps finally faded into the heavy oak doors of the Rogers building. When I finally stepped out from behind the pillar, the sun hit my face, bright and blinding. I looked at the massive, iconic dome of MIT, and for the first time, I didn't feel fear. I felt a cold, crystalline focus. They thought I was 30 miles away, sitting in a crowded lecture hall at a local state school, settling for a life of quiet mediocrity. They didn't know I was right here, breathing the same air, walking the same halls. I was a ghost in their machine. The first year was a descent into a specific kind of madness. Because I had no parental financial backing, my scholarship and the grandmother's bonds only covered the bare minimum of tuition and my subterranean rent. Food, textbooks, lab fees, and basic survival fell entirely on my shoulders. My schedule was a brutal clockwork torture. I woke up at 4:30 a.m. every morning to work a 3-hour shift cleaning the espresso machines and prepping pastries at a campus coffee shop. By 8 a.m., I was in advanced thermodynamics, my fingers still smelling like roasted coffee beans and chemical sanitizer. After afternoon labs, I rushed to the campus library, where I worked as a data entry clerk until 9 p.m. And from 10 p.m. until 2 a.m., I sat on the linoleum floor of my basement apartment, studying until the text blurred into illegible squiggles before my bloodshot eyes. I lost weight. My skin turned a translucent, pale gray from the lack of sunlight, and a diet that consisted almost entirely of day-old bagels the coffee shop let me take home. Meanwhile, Julian was thriving in the public eye. Because my parents paid for his lifestyle, he didn't have to work a single hour. He joined a prestigious fraternity, bought a high-end road bike to cruise through the city, and spent his weekends networking at mixers. Occasionally, our paths would inevitably cross in the massive interconnected hallways known as the Infinite Corridor. The first time it happened, it was November. A bitter, icy wind was howling outside, and I was rushing to an exam, clutching a stack of loose papers to my chest, wearing a thin coat I'd bought at a thrift store for $5. Julian was walking with a group of his fraternity brothers, laughing loudly. He froze when he saw me. The laughter died on his lips. His friends kept walking, but Julian stepped out of the crowd, his eyes scanning my hollow cheeks and my frayed sleeves.
"Maya," he whispered, his voice laced with absolute disbelief.
What? What are you doing here? Mom said you were living in the dorms at State. I lied, I said flatly, not stopping my pace. I kept walking, and he had to scramble to keep up with me, his expensive leather boots clicking sharply against the floor. Are you insane? Julian hissed, looking around frantically as if our parents might materialize from the walls. If Dad finds out you're here, using his name, defying him like this. I'm not using his name, Julian, I interrupted, stopping abruptly and turning to face him. The intensity in my eyes made him take half a step back. I'm using mine. Dad doesn't pay a single cent here. He doesn't even know I exist on this campus. So you keep your mouth shut, or I will walk right into Dad's country club next Thanksgiving and show everyone the forged signature he used to try and reroute my inheritance. Julian's face went pale. He swallowed hard, his eyes dropping to the floor. "You're killing yourself, Maya. Look at you. You look like a ghost." "Then let me be a ghost," I said softly, turning my back on him and disappearing into the crowd of students. He didn't tell them. Whether it was out of fear of what I would do, or a lingering, repressed sense of guilt, Julian kept my secret. Every Sunday night, I had to endure the mandatory family phone call. I would sit in my damp basement, listening to my mother gush over Julian's life, while I pretended to talk about a state college campus I had never set foot on. "The campus here is nice, Mom," I would say, my voice sounding flat and dead to my own ears. "The library is quiet." "That's wonderful, dear," she would reply carelessly, her mind already drifting back to her golden boy. "Oh, Julian just told us he made the dean's list. Your father is over the moon. He's taking us all to Aruba for spring break to celebrate. We'd invite you, but we know your state school schedule is different. And honestly, the flights are just so expensive this time of year." "I understand," I said, staring at a crack in my basement wall, where a small stream of muddy water was slowly trickling down. "Celebrate Julian. He deserves it." I hung up the phone, threw it against the mattress, and buried my head in my knees. The loneliness was in physical weight, a suffocating darkness that pressed down on my chest until I couldn't breathe. I was doing everything right. I was maintaining a perfect 4.0 GPA in one of the hardest programs in the world, while working 40 hours a week, surviving on scraps, and being completely erased by the people who brought me into this world. I reached my absolute breaking point during the winter finals of my sophomore year. It had been raining ice for 3 days straight. I had just finished an 8-hour shift at the library, my body shivering violently from a fever I had been trying to ignore for a week. As I walked down the concrete stairs to my basement apartment, my foot slipped on a patch of black ice. I fell hard, my shoulder slamming against the iron railing, my backpack bursting open. My laptop, the cheap, refurbished one I had bought with my coffee shop tips, flew across the alleyway and smashed into a puddle of freezing slush. I sat there in the dark, icy mud, the freezing rain soaking through my thin jacket, staring at the shattered screen of my only tool for survival. All my notes, all my research, my upcoming final project, everything was on that drive. A ragged, choking sob broke through my throat. I couldn't do it anymore. The universe was screaming at me to give up, confirming what my father had always said. "You don't have the potential. You aren't built for the stratosphere." I curled up on the wet concrete, letting the freezing rain wash over my face, completely prepared to just lie there until the cold took the pain away entirely. I don't know how long I lay there on the frozen concrete, the icy slush soaking through my jeans, numbing my skin until the physical pain of my bruised shoulder faded into a dull, distant ache. The broken laptop lay a few feet away, its cracked screen reflecting the sickly amber glow of a street lamp. It looked exactly how I felt, shattered, discarded, and entirely empty. "Giving up is a highly inefficient response to gravity, Miss Vance." The voice was low, gravelly, and entirely devoid of pity. I blinked through the icy rain, my vision blurry, to see a pair of heavy, mud-splattered leather boots standing right next to my ruined backpack. I looked up. Looming over me was Professor Arthur Sterling, the notoriously ruthless head of the Materials Science and Engineering Department. He was a man feared by every undergraduate at MIT, a brilliant, reclusive researcher who treated his students like variables in a complex equation and had zero tolerance for emotional weakness. He didn't offer me his hand. He didn't ask if I was okay. Instead, he reached down, picked up my dripping, shattered laptop, and inspected it with a clinical frown. "The chassis is compromised, but the solid-state drive is likely intact," he said, setting it back down on my cardboard box. He then looked down at me, his sharp gray eyes cutting through the darkness like two lasers. "Are you going to freeze to death in an alleyway over an unbacked-up hard drive? Or are you going to get up and fix it?" I swallowed the lump of pride and despair in my throat, pushing myself up using the iron railing. My knees shook violently, but I managed to stand, wiping the freezing mud from my jacket. "It's not just the laptop, Professor," I whispered, my voice cracking from the fever burning in my chest. "It's everything." Professor Sterling adjusted his umbrella, his expression unreadable. "I've been tracking your lab submissions, Maya. Your analysis on crystalline lattice defects in quantum computing materials is the most elegant work I've seen from an undergraduate in a decade. But your physical attendance is erratic. Your body mass is clearly declining, and you look like you're surviving on caffeine and sheer spite. Explain the variable." I looked at him, too exhausted to maintain the elaborate web of lies I had spun for 2 years. "I don't have funding," I said flatly, the raw truth spilling out before I could stop it. "My parents pay for my twin brother, Julian. They told me I didn't have the potential to justify the investment. I work 40 hours a week just to pay tuition and rent a basement that floods when it rains." Sterling stared at me for a long, agonizing moment. The rain drummed a steady, rhythmic beat against his umbrella. I braced myself for the standard, detached administrative response, a lecture on budgeting, a referral to the student crisis office, or worse, a look of pity. Instead, a faint, terrifyingly brilliant smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Your parents are idiots," Sterling said smoothly, "and they are remarkably poor analysts of human capital. Potential isn't a spark, Miss Vance. It's a heat-resistant alloy forged under extreme pressure. Come to my lab tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. I need a research assistant who understands what it means to work in the dark. The position pays a full stipend and covers total tuition. Do not be late." He turned on his heel and walked away, disappearing into the sheets of gray rain before I could even find the breath to say thank you. That night, as I sat under a pile of cheap blankets in my damp apartment, coughing from the fever, a strange, powerful warmth began to bloom in my chest. For 2 years, I had been running on the fumes of my family's rejection, fueled by a desperate need to prove them wrong. But as I stared at the note Sterling had written on a scrap of paper with his lab's access code, the nature of my fuel changed. I didn't want to just prove them wrong anymore. I wanted to build a reality so monumentally vast that their opinions of me wouldn't even register as white noise. The next morning, at precisely 5:55 a.m., I stood outside the heavy glass doors of the Sterling Quantum Materials Lab. That day marked the beginning of my true transformation. Working under Sterling wasn't an escape from hardship. It was an upgrade to a higher tier of struggle. He pushed me harder than any professor had ever pushed a student. He threw me into doctoral-level datasets, demanded absolute precision, and tore my drafts to shreds with red ink. But for every critique he gave, he offered a masterclass in intellectual survival. For the first time in my life, I wasn't a shadow. I was a collaborator.
"Stop looking at your data as a defensive argument, Maya,"
Sterling told me 6 months into my residency, as we stood over a scanning electron microscope. "You are not begging the scientific community for permission to be right. You are presenting an objective truth that you discovered. Let the numbers do the screaming for you." With the tuition completely covered by the research stipend, I was finally able to quit the coffee shop and the data entry job. I moved out of the subterranean dampness into a small, sunlit room closer to the lab. I began to eat real meals. The gray pallor of my skin replaced itself with a healthy, vibrant glow. My posture changed. The protective, rounded shoulders of a neglected child straightened into the commanding presence of a woman who knew exactly what she was worth. Julian noticed the change immediately. We still managed to avoid each other for the most part. But one afternoon in our junior year, we crossed paths outside the student center. He was holding a C- midterm exam paper, looking thoroughly stressed, his golden boy charm wearing thin under the brutal, grinding reality of MIT's upper-level curriculum. He stopped and looked at me, his eyes widening as he took in my tailored trench coat, my clear skin, and the quiet, unbothered confidence radiating from me. "You look different, Maya," he said, his voice laced with a strange hint of envy. "Mom keeps asking why you never ask for money from your local bank account. She thinks you've taken out massive student loans at State. Tell Mom I'm doing perfectly fine, I said, offering him a calm, polite smile that didn't reach my eyes. How are your classes going, Julian? Dad must be looking forward to your junior report card. Julian winced, crumpling the exam paper slightly behind his back. It's hard, okay? Dad calls every night asking about my class ranking. He's already planning this massive celebration for graduation next year. He keeps talking about how the Vance family name is finally going to mean something in the tech world. I'm sure it will, I murmured softly. Are you ever going to tell them? Julian asked, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. They're coming up for the commencement ceremony next year, Maya. If they see you here, they'll see exactly what they chose to see, Julian, I said, stepping past him. Don't stress your potential over it. As I walked away, I felt a profound sense of psychological clarity. The trap was set, not by my hands, but by their own staggering arrogance. They had built a fantasy world where Julian was a god and I was a failure, and they had insulated themselves so deeply within that lie that they were entirely blind to the storm gathering on the horizon. By the start of our senior year, Professor Sterling and I had co-authored 3 groundbreaking papers on topological insulators. The scientific community was taking notice. But the biggest secret, the one that would permanently alter the trajectory of my life, was kept behind locked doors in the dean's office. Every year, MIT selects a single student to deliver the valedictory address, an honor determined by a rigorous panel of faculty members who evaluate academic perfection, research contributions, and leadership. 3 weeks before graduation, I received an official letter stamped with the university gold seal. I sat at my desk, my fingers trembling slightly as I broke the wax. As my eyes scanned the elegant typography, a single tear, not of sadness, but of pure, unadulterated triumph, slipped down my cheek. The stage was set. The invitations had been sent. My parents had already booked their front row VIP seats to watch their golden son graduate. They had no idea they were actually RSVPing to the public execution of their own pride. The final 3 weeks before graduation passed in a blur of surreal, calculated stillness. I lived 2 lives that never touched. In one life, I was the valedictorian of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, rehearsing my commencement speech in the mirror of my sunlit apartment, perfecting every pause, every inflection, every breath. In the other life, I was still Maya, the invisible daughter, at the end of a crackling phone line, listening to the final arrangements for Julian's coronation. We booked a private room at the top of the hub for the dinner afterward, Maya, my mother announced during our final Sunday phone call. Her voice was frantic with the high society stress she loved to manufacture. Your father invited his entire country club board. It's a massive networking opportunity for Julian. We'd love for you to fly in from state, but frankly, the dinner is a set menu at $200 a head, and with Julian's post-grad moving expenses to Silicon Valley, we really have to watch the budget. You understand, don't you? I completely understand, Mom, I said. I was sitting at my lab bench, staring at a high-resolution printout of the commencement program. My name was printed at the very top in bold, raised lettering, Valedictory Address, Maya Lynn Vance. You should focus entirely on Julian. He's the one who needs the spotlight. You're always so practical, Maya, she said, letting out a sigh of relief that tasted like pure validation of my invisibility. It's a wonderful trait. Your father always says your grounded nature will serve you well in a modest administrative career. Tell Dad I keep his words close to my heart, I murmured before hanging up the phone. I looked across the lab at Professor Sterling, who was meticulously calibrating a laser spectrometer. He hadn't looked up during my call, but his sharp voice cut through the hum of the cooling fans. The psychological weight you carry is a fascinating variable, Maya. Most people would have cracked under the desire to scream the truth 2 years ago. Why didn't you? Because a scream is chaotic, Professor, I replied, folding the program neatly and sliding it into my bag. A scream gives them time to prepare a defense. They would have spun a narrative to save their pride. They would have claimed they pushed me to state to build my character, or that they secretly funded my journey through an anonymous donor. I don't want them to have a narrative. I want them to have nothing but the truth, raw and unedited, in a room full of the people they respect most. Sterling stopped adjusting the dials. He turned around, leaning his hip against the heavy slate lab bench, looking at me with a rare expression of deep academic respect. You aren't just breaking them, are you? You're conducting a controlled demolition. They designed the building, Professor, I said softly. I'm just removing the load-bearing lies. The day before graduation, the city of Cambridge was swallowed by a vibrant, energetic chaos. The streets were choked with U-Haul trucks, limousines, and thousands of families draped in Harvard and MIT colors. I watched them from my apartment window, feeling a profound sense of emotional detachment. I didn't feel angry anymore. The fiery resentment that had kept me awake during those freezing nights in my sophomore basement had sublimated into something much more dangerous. Absolute, unshakable calm. That evening, my phone buzzed with a text from Julian. They're here. We just checked into the hotel. Dad is beside himself. He keeps telling everyone at the front desk that his son is graduating from the engineering department. Maya? I saw the rehearsal schedule posted near the main stage today. Your name is on it. What did you do? I didn't reply. I turned my phone face down on the desk, crawled into bed, and slept for a solid uninterrupted 8 hours. For the first time in 4 years, I didn't dream of falling. The morning of commencement arrived with a crisp, brilliant blue sky that seemed almost too perfect for the gravity of the day. The air was cool, carrying the scent of cut grass and the salty tang of the Charles River. I dressed with meticulous care. I wore a simple, elegant navy silk dress beneath my heavy, dark graduation gown. I pinned my hair up, leaving my face completely uncovered, exposed, and clear. When I arrived at the staging area behind the massive Killian Court, the sea of black gowns and crimson sashes was overwhelming. Hundreds of the most brilliant minds of my generation were laughing, taking selfies, and adjusting each other's caps. And then I saw Julian. He was standing near the entrance of the engineering cohort, looking incredibly handsome in his tailored suit, his cap sitting perfectly on his thick hair. But the moment his eyes caught mine across the crowd, the color drained from his face entirely. He broke away from his group, pushing past several students until he reached me. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely keep his diploma folder steady. Maya, he gasped, his voice a frantic whisper. Tell me you're just here as a spectator. Tell me you sneaked in to watch. Look at my gown, Julian, I said, my voice as smooth as glass. Look at the gold cords around my neck. You don't get these for spectating. But how? He stammered, his eyes darting around as if the entire campus were a trap closing in on him. Dad and Mom are in the third row, right in the center. Dad has spent $3,000 to get VIP alumni seating through a business partner. Maya, please. If you go out there, you're going to destroy him. You're going to destroy Mom. I reached out, my fingers gently straightening the crooked tassel on Julian's cap. I looked into his eyes, feeling nothing but a distant, quiet pity. They destroyed themselves the night they decided my worth was a mathematical equation, Julian, I said softly. Go line up. Your potential is waiting. The music began, the deep, resonant brass notes of the processional echoing across the courtyard, signaling the march of the graduates. The crowd shifted, turning into a massive, orderly river of black fabric, moving toward the light of the main stage. I took my place at the very front of the line, right behind the faculty marshals and Professor Sterling, who gave me a single, slow nod of his head. As I stepped out from beneath the shadow of the Rogers, building into the bright, blinding sun of Killian Court, the roar of thousands of spectators hit me like a physical wave. I kept my chin high, my eyes fixed straight ahead, navigating the massive stage until I reached the designated seat labeled Valedictorian. I sat down, smoothed the fabric of my gown, and finally permitted myself to look down into the third row of the VIP section. There they were. My father was leaning back in his chair, his arm draped arrogantly over the back of my mother's seat. A smug, triumphant smile plastered across his face as he scanned the rows of graduates for Julian. My mother was adjusting her sunglasses, her designer handbag resting precisely on her lap, a picture of suburban perfection. The university president took the microphone, his voice booming across the speakers, welcoming the dignitaries, the alumni, and the families. I watched my father nod along to the platitudes, completely secure in his reality. "And now," the president's voice echoed, the tone shifting to one of profound reverence. "To deliver the valedictory address for the graduating class, an individual who has not only maintained a flawless academic record, but has co-authored 3 pioneering discoveries in the field of quantum materials.
Please welcome to the podium, Maya Lynn Vance."
The applause erupted, thousands of hands clapping in unison. I stood up, the heavy silk of my gown rustling around my ankles, and walked toward the microphone. Down in the 3rd row, I watched the smug smile freeze on my father's face. I watched my mother's sunglasses slip down the bridge of her nose, her jaw dropping as her eyes locked onto my face, projected 50 feet high on the massive digital screens flanking the stage. The microphone before me was a slender stem of dark steel, catching the brilliant glare of the morning sun. As I stepped up to it, the roaring applause of 10,000 people began to taper off, settling into a heavy, expectant silence that blanketed the entire expanse of Killian Court. I adjusted the small paper containing my notes, though I didn't need them. I had memorized every syllable of this moment during the long, freezing walks through the infinite corridor. I leaned forward slightly, looking directly past the camera lenses, past the faculty members, and straight into the 3rd row of the VIP section. My mother's hands were trembling violently now. She had dropped her designer sunglasses onto the grass, completely unbothered by the scratch they likely sustained, her fingers clutching my father's arm with a desperate, white-knuckled grip. My father looked as though he had been struck by lightning. His mouth was slightly open, his face an unnatural, sickly shade of ash gray. He kept blinking, staring up at the massive digital screens, trying to find a version of reality where this was a hallucination. They looked so small from up here. For years they had loomed over my life like giants, dictating my value with a casual nod or a dismissive wave of the hand. But from the height of this podium, they were just 2 fragile, stunned people drowning in a sea of strangers who were clapping for the daughter they had thrown away. Members of the faculty, distinguished guests, families, and my fellow graduates, I began, my voice clear, steady, and amplified to a crisp, cinematic resonance that echoed off the surrounding stone pillars. 4 years ago, I was given a lesson in mathematics. I was told that human potential could be calculated like a corporate balance sheet. I was told that some investments are guaranteed to yield a return, while others are simply a waste of capital. Down in the audience, I saw my father stiffen. His shoulders squared instinctively, a defensive reflex from a man who realized his own words were being used to construct his scaffolding. "When you are 18 years old," I continued, maintaining a calm conversational tone that made the emotional weight of the words cut even deeper. "And the people who gave you life tell you that you lack the basic potential to sit in these halls. You have 2 choices. You can believe them. Let their assessment become your ceiling and spend the rest of your life looking up at the sky through their limitations. Or you can choose to become a ghost in their system." A low murmur rippled through the student section. I saw Julian lower his head into his hands, unable to look at the stage anymore. "I chose to become a ghost," I said softly, a faint, elegant smile touching my lips. "I came to this university without a single dollar of family support, without an inheritance, and without a single cheer from home. I worked 40 hours a week cleaning espresso machines, entering data in the dark hours of the night, and living in a basement that flooded every time it rained. I learned what it meant to survive on the crumbs of a dream." I paused, letting the silence stretch across the courtyard. The audience was completely spellbound, the emotional raw honesty of the speech gripping the crowd in a way that standard platitude-heavy graduation speeches never could. But the beautiful thing about pressure, I said, glancing over at Professor Sterling, who was watching me with a look of quiet, profound pride, is that it rearranges the atoms of your soul. It forces you to stop looking for validation from people who are blind to your light. I didn't find my worth because someone handed it to me. I found it in the laboratory at 3 a.m., analyzing crystalline structures, realizing that the strongest materials are the ones that have suffered the most defects and yet refused to shatter. I turned my gaze back to my parents. My mother had pulled her hand away from my father's arm and was now pressing a white lace handkerchief to her eyes, her shoulders shaking with silent, ragged sobs. My father wasn't moving at all.
He looked utterly paralyzed, realizing that every prominent alumni and business colleague he had spent the morning bragging to was now listening to his daughter detail the systematic abandonment she had suffered under his roof. The public image he had spent a lifetime curating was evaporating in real time, dismantled by the very daughter he had deemed a bad investment. To my fellow graduates, I concluded, my voice swelling with a powerful, empowering warmth. Never let someone who hasn't walked your path define your destination. Your potential is not a fixed variable. It is a fire that you stoke with your own sacrifice, your own resilience, and your own unshakable belief in your worth. Thank you. The moment the final word left my lips, the auditorium erupted. The entire graduating class stood up in a massive synchronized wave of black and crimson, their cheers tearing through the morning air. Thousands of caps were waved, hands slammed together in a thunderous ovation that seemed to vibrate through the very stage beneath my feet. I stood there, taking a slow, deep breath, letting the warmth of the applause wash over me, cleansing away the lingering chill of that sophomore alleyway. I didn't bow. I didn't smile excessively. I simply gave a polite, dignified nod to the crowd, turned around and walked back to my seat. As I sat down, Professor Sterling leaned over slightly, his sharp gray eyes crinkling at the corners. "An exceptionally elegant demolition, Mrs. Vance," he whispered under the cover of the applause. "The numbers did exactly what you promised." They screamed. "Thank you, Professor," I said, my heart finally settling into a calm, steady rhythm. But the data set isn't quite complete yet. I looked back down into the crowd as the university president stepped back to the podium to begin the presentation of diplomas. My parents were no longer looking at the stage. They were staring at the floor, suddenly isolated in the middle of a crowded room, completely crushed under the weight of a truth they could no longer run from. The recessional music played a triumphant, booming melody that echoed off the limestone facade of Killian Court, signaling the official end of the ceremony. The orderly lines of graduates quickly dissolved into a chaotic, joyous sea of black fabric, flying caps, and emotional embraces. Families flooded the green, carrying bouquets of flowers and popping champagne corks. I stood near the edge of the lawn, intentionally separated from the main crowd, leaning against the same granite pillar that had shielded me 4 years ago. I held my leather diploma folder in one hand, feeling the heavy, textured weight of the paper inside. I didn't have a crowd of cousins, aunts, or family friends waiting to take my picture. I had exactly one person. Professor Sterling walked up to me, a rare glass of celebratory sparkling cider in his hand. He looked at the diploma folder, then up at my face. "The department has officially processed your postdoctoral fellowship funding, Maya. You start in September. Your own lab, your own budget, your own terms." "Thank you, Arthur," I said, using his first name for the very first time. It felt natural. He had earned the title of my peer, just as he had earned my lifelong gratitude. For everything. "You did the lifting, Maya." "I just pointed out the levers," he said smoothly, taking a sip before checking his watch. "The university luncheon begins in 20 minutes. I expect you to be there. The dean wants to introduce you to a few venture capitalists who are very interested in your quantum lattice research." "I'll be there in 10 minutes, I promised." He gave me a final, approving nod and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of faculty members. I watched him go, feeling a deep, profound sense of peace. My future was secure.
It wasn't built on a foundation of parental approval or inherited wealth. It was built on the unshakable bedrock of my own intellect and labor. Maya. The voice came from behind me. It was hesitant, fragile, and stripped of all the domestic authority it had held for over 2 decades. I turned around slowly, smoothing the front of my graduation gown. My mother and father were standing 5 feet away. Julian stood slightly behind them, his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes fixed firmly on his own shoes. He looked completely drained, a man who had spent the last 2 hours processing the fact that his entire life had been lived in a subsidized bubble that had just popped.
My mother looked devastatingly undone.
Her eyes were red and swollen, her immaculate makeup ruined by the tear tracks that had stained her cheeks. She was gripping her purse so tightly her knuckles were white, her lower lip trembling as she looked at me. My father looked 10 years older. The arrogant, broad-shouldered posture he always assumed at his country club was gone, replaced by a hollow, defensive slump. Maya.
Sweetheart.
My mother choked out, taking a small, tentative step toward me, her hand reaching out automatically before dropping back to her side when she saw the complete lack of emotion on my face. We didn't know. Why didn't you tell us? Tell you what, Mom? I asked, my voice flat, calm, and conversational. I didn't yell. I didn't let an ounce of anger into my tone. I spoke to them with the same polite, detached professionalism I used with freshman lab students. That I was capable of doing exactly what you paid Julian to fail at. My father flinched as if I had struck him across the face. He stepped forward, his throat clearing, trying to summon a fraction of his old paternal authority, but the words failed him. Maya, the speech, what you said up there in front of everyone. It wasn't fair. We made a financial decision based on the information we had at the time. We didn't mean to. You made a decision based on your arrogance, Dad, I interrupted, cutting through his defense with surgical precision. You didn't look at my grades, my research, or my drive. You looked at my compliance. You assumed that because I didn't demand your attention, I didn't deserve your investment. You explicitly told me that I had no potential, and that Julian did. It was simple mathematics, remember? Maya, please, my mother wept, a fresh wave of tears spilling down her face. She reached out and grabbed my father's arm again, exactly as she had done on the big screen during the speech. We are your parents. We love you. We've always loved you. We were trying to balance everything.
You didn't balance anything, Mom. You erased me,
I said softly, looking her dead in the eye. You spent 4 years telling your friends I was sitting in a crowded lecture hall at a state school, while I was working 3 jobs and surviving on day-old bagels in a basement that smelled of mold. You canceled flights to visit me because you had to pay for Julian's fraternity dues. You didn't even pour me a glass of champagne the night we got our acceptance letters. My father swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously to a group of passing MIT trustees who were looking over at our family with distinct expressions of disapproval. He realized, with terrifying clarity, that the story of his cruelty was already circulating through the campus. What do you want from us, Maya? My father whispered, his voice cracking, completely broken. Do you want an apology? We're sorry, we were wrong. Is that what you need to hear? I looked at him, and for the first time in my life, I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no resentment, no desire to hurt him back. The revenge wasn't in screaming at them. The revenge was the realization that their opinions no longer carried any currency in my world. I don't need anything from you, Dad, I said, offering a small, polite, and thoroughly chilling smile. An apology is just a recalculation after the investment fails. It doesn't change the data. You backed the wrong horse. That's simple mathematics. Silence that followed my words was absolute, a heavy, unyielding vacuum that my parents had no vocabulary to fill. My father stared at me, his mouth opening slightly, as if to offer one final corporate defense. But the sheer weight of my indifference crushed the words before they could leave his throat. My mother simply buried her face in her hands, her shoulders rocking with the quiet, devastating realization that she was no longer a mother to the woman standing before her. She was just an architect of an empty house. I turned my gaze to Julian. He was looking at me through a haze of quiet realization. The sibling rivalry that my parents had manufactured and fueled for 22 years had evaporated, leaving behind nothing but the stark, unvarnished truth. "I'm sorry, Maya," Julian whispered, his voice barely audible over the chatter of the departing crowd. I should have stood up. I should have told them to stop. "It's okay, Julian," I said, and for the first time, a genuine soft warmth touched my voice. "You didn't build the system. You were just comfortable living inside it. But the bubble is gone now. You have to walk on your own feet." I glanced down at my watch. It was precisely 11:45 a.m. The university luncheon was starting, and my new life, the one I had carved out of the frost and concrete of my sophomore year, was waiting for me behind the glass doors of the faculty club. "I have to go," I said, adjusting my graduation gown over my shoulders. "My department head is expecting me. There are people I need to meet." "Maya, wait!" my mother cried, taking a frantic step forward, her hand outstretched like a drowning woman reaching for a ghost. "What about the dinner tonight? At the top of the hub?"
"We have the private room."
"We can change the reservation. We can add a seat for you. We can celebrate both of you. Please, Maya, let us do this right." I stopped and looked back at her over my shoulder. I looked at the expensive pastel suit, the ruined makeup, and the desperate, late-stage regret pooling in her eyes. It was an invitation I would have crawled through broken glass for 4 years ago. I would have sacrificed my own health, my own sleep, and my own dignity just to hear her say she wanted me at that table. But the woman who needed that validation had died in the freezing rain of that sophomore alleyway, and the woman who stood here today was entirely whole without it. "Enjoy your dinner, Mom," I said softly, my voice completely free of malice, carrying only the weight of an unshakable boundary. But my seat at your table was cleared a long time ago. I've already built my own. I didn't wait to see them turn around. I didn't watch them walk away toward their luxury car. I simply turned my back on the past, my heels clicking firmly against the stone walkway as I walked toward the faculty building. With every step I took, the phantom weight of their expectations, their rejections, and their cruel calculations slid off my shoulders, dissolving into the cool morning air. True revenge, I realized as I stepped into the sunlit lobby of the faculty club, isn't about destroying the people who hurt you. It's not about watching them weep, or forcing them into public humiliation, or holding a grudge like a burning coal in your palm. Those are the reactions of a soul that is still trapped within their cage. True revenge is becoming so completely sovereign, so fundamentally independent, and so profoundly healed that their presence or absence no longer alters the temperature of your room. It is turning the poison they fed you into the medicine that cures your fear. The dean of the department spotted me from across the room, his face lighting up with a brilliant smile as he gestured toward a group of international investors and researchers. "Ah, here she is," he announced proudly, his voice echoing through the elegant room. "The valedictorian of the hour. Everyone, please meet Dr. Maya Vance." I stepped into the circle, extending my hand, my voice calm, clear, and resonant. As I began to speak about the future of quantum materials, about the structures that survive the highest pressures and the darkest environments, I knew that the laboratory of my life was finally operating at absolute perfection. The dark hours were over. The ghost had left the machine. And for the first time in my life, I was standing completely, beautifully, and undeniably in my own light.